question is, will demographics bankrupt Massachusetts? And this is a question that the Patrick administration is actually working on now. Tonight, I'm going to make an attempt to look out to 2030. The administration is looking at a shorter period of time, just over the next 10 years or so. But no one has an answer to this yet. It's a problem that we're working on now. So here's a preview and outline. So will demographics bankrupt Massachusetts? And the answer is no, it won't. But healthcare spending might. So, you know, we could have walked out of here, or class could have ended early. But it's not demographics, it's healthcare spending that we'll see as the problem. And so here's what I want to do. I want to look at the current revenue situation, just for context. Notice that there are two methods of projecting long-term revenue growth. And then we want to focus on one of those methods, demographic simulation of future revenue. And I'm just going to look at the income tax, state income tax for that. And then we'll combine some spending projections with revenue projections and see what the budget balance is over the long term. So here's the current revenue situation for the state. The blue line here, squiggly line, are revenues from the mid-90s through the present. Monthly revenues, seasonally adjusted and smoothed. And you'll notice that throughout the 1990s, revenues were growing at about a 6% rate of growth per year, 6% trend rate of growth. That turns out to be a critical rate because the long-term projections for state spending are going to be about 6%. We'll start to inch north of that after a decade or so. And you can see what happened in the dot-com recession. Revenues actually fell to a new trend line that was below the one of the 1990s. And again, in this recession, we had a great fall in revenues, and it looks like we might be growing revenues again on a trend line, but at one that's lower than in the 2000s. Not sure of that situation yet. It could be that we will get up to the 2000 trend line. But that difference between the blue line and the green line represents what I consider the real structural deficit, which is huge. It means we're not providing the same level of state public goods and services that we were in the 1990s. And so that's a problem going forward. Now, two methods of projecting long-term revenue growth. There's econometric forecasts and demographic simulation. And you'd hope that these two methods would give consistent, coherent projections. I'm going to show some medium-term econometric forecasts at the end of near the end of my presentation and focus on the demographic simulation for the major part of my presentation. So I'm going to apply this to state income taxes in 2030 versus 2007. And what we're going to estimate here is just the pure demographic change. Just the change that's due to demographics. To get the full change, say, in income tax revenues, you'd also want to apply real income growth, which would essentially come from productivity growth. Now, we will get some productivity growth just because of demographic change as people shift to a new mix of industry and occupation employment. But that's not total productivity growth. And you'd also want to add inflation as well. We're not going to do that today. Here are the steps. Seven steps to this projection. We'll go through them pretty quickly. One is to use a census projection of the Massachusetts population by age. I think, Alicia, you probably used that in your work. And then a Bureau of Labor Statistics projection of labor force participation rates. That will yield an employment projections. And then that will also yield targets of population by employment status, that is employed or not employed. And to that, we'll apply a Bureau of Labor Statistics and State Division of Unemployment Assistance projection of the industry occupation mix of employment. And that will give us, in step 5, targets of employment by industry and occupation for 2030. And how we're going to estimate income tax revenues is we're going to use a micro simulator applied to the American Community Survey of 2006 to 2008 that will grow out to 2030 by adjusting the weights to meet the targets from step 5. But this is a class, so I want to spend some time on the methodology of these demographic projections. And I'm relying upon the census and the BLS for most of this projection work. And so here's a really simple look at how the census projects population growth. How they do it is more detailed than this, but conceptually is not very different, and it's a very straightforward approach. So they use that equation there, that the population next year is the population this year plus births plus deaths plus net internal migration, that's migration from other states in the country, plus net international migration, migration from other countries. And the census does this at the state level, and they use a cohort component method, so they look at each single year of age and sex. So they run this equation for each age, sex, cohort by state.
And death would be a negative number in this context.
That's right.
Okay,
Death would
good.
be a negative number.
Just with you, I'm with you now.
We will edit that, right? That's right. Fertility and death rates to calculate births and deaths are from the National Center for Health Statistics. The methodology here is to use historical data to help project the future. So things like fertility rates and mortality rates are fairly stable over time, very stable in the short run, and even very stable in the medium term. So you can use historical fertility and mortality rates to get a pretty reliable projection of the population plus births minus deaths. Now for a net internal migration, the Census Bureau uses IRS data. People file their income tax to the IRS and they state where they live. And the IRS uses this data to compute state-to-state migration flows. That gives aggregate flows. The 2000 census also asks about 5-year migration and gives a rich demographic profile of migrants. So the demographic detail of that interstate migration is supplied by the 2000 decennial census. Now for net international migration, historical rates at the national level are derived from history, fairly straightforward, and the Census 2000 is again used to give the demographic richness of that international migration by country of origin, by age and sex, and so on. And that leads the census to provide these forecasts of population by state, by age, and by sex for each year. And the current forecast, or the one I used, is 2007 to 2030. Now for the BLS projection. So here are the steps. And again, there's a lot of detail in this, but conceptually it's fairly simple, and here are the steps they use. They project labor force participation rates from history using the current population survey and simply extrapolate those rates to the future. This BLS employment projection that I'm talking about here goes only until 2018. So I'm just simply projecting these onward from 2018 to 2030. Then they use projections for GDP and the demand components. If you've taken Ec 101, you know GDP is the sum of consumption, that's C, plus investment demand, plus government demand, plus exports minus imports. I got the minus sign right on this one. And that's projected by an econometric model, and that's made consistent with step 1. In step 3, just as an example, take the consumer demand and distribute that by sector to 88 detailed sectors derived by some model that economists have created to project consumer demand by sector. Then you can, knowing that, you can project employment by industry that's derived from these now detailed C plus I plus G plus X minus M demands using an input-output model. And then in step 5, you also need to project the trends in the occupational distribution within each industry. That is a tricky matter. And that's done by an iterative process of qualitative and quantitative analysis. And finally, this is done at the national level, and state departments then take these projections and tailor them for the state, for their own state. And so I've used the Division of Unemployment Assistance projection for 2018. And what I've done to project employment is the following. Well, let's start with population. So let's look at the results of these projections. This is from the census population projection for Massachusetts, 2007 to 2030, and here are the growths by age group. Now you've seen this slide before, I noticed, because it's right on the website for this semester's course, right? And we see dramatic growth in the upper age groups, 65 and over, and a loss of population in the 45 to 54-year age group. And of course, what we're seeing here is simply the baby boom bulge as it ages. Now, to get from population to employment, we need to know what happens with labor force participation rates. So I've taken the BLS projections through 2018 and just translated them not into labor force rates, but employment rates. So what proportion of the population in each age group is employed. And you can see the slight slope from 2007 through 2018 from the BLS projections. I've just straight lined those projections from 2018 onward through 2030. And here's the crucial part of this demographic story. The top 3 lines there are practically superimposed upon one another. It says that the employment rates for those who are prime working age, 25 years to 54 years of age, is essentially about 80%. Now, if we look at those 2 segments of the population that are expected to grow quickly, the 65 to 74, the 65 to 74 and the 75 plus, those are the age groups that have the lowest labor force and employment rates. And so, even though these rates are expected to rise, we're seeing population shift from being high rate, aging, and going into having a lower rate of employment. And that's going to affect our projections for employment. And so here they are for Massachusetts. From the census, the population employment growth for Massachusetts. And this is based at 2007 being 100. So population grows about 6.7%. But because the overall employment rate is declining as population shifts from high employment rate to low employment rate age cohorts, even as population grows, employment after growing and peaking in 2018 will start to decline, simply due to demographics. So it is true that demographics is destiny and that it will be affecting our employment. Also, let's take a quick look at what the industrial and occupational distribution may look like in the future. This is not from what I'm presenting to you tonight, but from another study in which I looked through 2020. So don't look at the numbers themselves, but the changes by industry and occupation are still instructive here. And you can see that in terms of industries, the state will see increases in professional and business services and in education and health services. That's no surprise if you've been in this course. The decline in manufacturing, that's part of the long-term secular decline as productivity increases in that sector. And in terms of occupations, 22 detailed occupations here. I just want to highlight a few. We'll see an increase in a lot of the technical and highly paid occupations. Here's computer and mathematical occupations, an increase in employment, healthcare support largely due to the aging population, and contrast that with the production occupations, which will see a decline. This gives us targets for population and employment by industry and occupation and age group for Massachusetts for 2030. The next step is to take the American Community Survey and change the household and person weights on it so that that survey will now look like the 2030 population. And the methodology here is actually quite simple and kind of neat, partly because it's simple. So the targets are expressed as two target matrices. One, a population by employment status matrix of 8 age groups by employed or not. So just the number of people in each of those 16 cells. And also an employment by industry and occupation status. Given the number of employed in 2030, that their distribution over 12 industries and 22 occupations. So that gives us 8 by 2 or 16 plus 12 by 22. Do that multiplication, you get, I don't know, 200 and something targets. And the key here is to optimize an objective function that is a least squares objective function. So we change the weights on the American Community Survey and then look at the current population after we've changed the weights, see how it compares to the target we have for each of the cells in these target matrices, take the difference and square it, and that's our squared error. Add those up over all the cells. So how do we change the weights? You iterate. You start with the first household on the American Community Survey, and change its weight. Increase it by 1%, and see if that little change improves the closeness to the targets. If it does, leave that change in there. If it doesn't improve it, see if decreasing the weight by 1% for that household improves the error between the population and the targets. And keep on doing that, moving through the American Community Survey, household by household, with a little nudge to the weight in either direction, until finally you meet the targets. Impossible for a person to do that a few decades ago. Now it's easy with computers. And then the final step is to use an income tax simulator. So now we take this reweighted American Community Survey and in effect put every sample household through a TurboTax and fill out the income tax form for them. And we have software to do that, sort of illustrated here, that divides the household into tax filing units, and then each filing unit fills out the form, just like TurboTax, and you do that for every household, and you simulate taxes that way. And here's the result of that. So here's the result of the demographic simulation. And the bottom line of this result is, it's not a dramatic change. The key result here is that income taxes per capita, tax liability per capita, just due to demographic change, not taking account productivity increases or inflation, will fall 4% per capita. And that's, of course, largely due to the aging of the population and fewer workers. It would have fallen more, except for the fact that as the population in Massachusetts is aging, it's also becoming more productive, going into industries and occupations that are on average more productive. So the net change in income taxes per capita is only 4%. Now, I'd say that's small because when you think about it, what kind of tax rate increase would you need to make that up? If you change income tax rate by 1 percentage point, you go from 5.3% to 6.3%. That's in effect a 20% change in the income tax rate. We're looking at a 4% change, so you could achieve that with just a couple tenths of a percent change in the income tax. That's another way of just saying that the demographic change in revenues due to this demographic shift of an aging population is not large, and it's one that can easily be absorbed in the state's economy. However, now let's combine that with not just revenues, but also spending as well. But first I want to look at that optional method for revenue forecasting, the econometric method for revenue forecasting. One, because I've only done this demographic projection for one tax, right, just for the income tax. So this is not complete at all. But I also have done an econometric forecast for the state medium term through fiscal year 2017 using an econometric model. So using a forecast of what'll employment and personal income and gross domestic product be in Massachusetts, and how would that affect revenues. And here's the forecast for revenues for Massachusetts through 2017. And the red line is the revenue rate of growth from year to year. So you can see revenues will be rising as we come out of this recession. It's somewhere between 4.5% to 5.5%. We'll get up near 6%. Now, if I were to continue this projection through 2030, given the demographic change of an aging population, lower employment, and we saw a slight increase in income taxes, the revenue would probably tail off a bit, probably slow down to about 5% per year as we go out to 2030. So now, let's combine that with a spending projections as well. And here's where the bad news comes in. So here is what the administration is thinking for long-term spending projections. Actually, they're looking at medium term, but let's apply that to long-term. They see, and here's the problem, health expenditures, state health expenditures growing at 8.5% to 9% per year throughout their horizon that they're looking at. And the rest of state expenditures being kept to a bare 3% per year. Now that's a pretty stern rate of growth for non-health expenditures, because 3% per year is about the rate of inflation in state and local expenditures. So that's essentially holding non-health expenditures at constant real levels over the foreseeable future. So health care spending is about, right now, about 40% of the state's budget. So what I've done here is start at 100 and looked at the long-term projection for health care spending, starting at 40% of the state budget and increasing at 8.5% per year. Here's what happens to health care spending through 2030. Non-health care spending starting at 60% of the state budget, growing at 3% per year. Add the red and green lines together and you get total spending growing at, starting at less than 6% per year, growing at about 6% per year through 2018, 19, 20, and then starting to grow it slowly and increasingly faster than 6% per year. Why? Because the healthcare costs are rising at 8.5% per year. Long-term revenue projections through fiscal year 17 from that earlier chart, and then projecting revenues to start growing at a slower rate of 5% per year. Here are the long-term revenue projections. So what we see here is a widening gap, and this really is a structural deficit. And this deficit will occur unless something is done about healthcare expenditures. And that gap by the end, 2030 here, is about 12% of spending. So that gap will begin to emerge around 2020 and get increasingly worse over time. Now, I started by giving the conclusion here. Will demographics bankrupt Massachusetts? No, it won't, but healthcare spending might. And then you might say, well, isn't healthcare spending, isn't this increase in healthcare spending, this 8.5% per year, isn't that due to demographics, the aging of the population? And the answer to that is no, it's not. Now, these are estimates from the CBO. The Dukakis Center has been working on healthcare spending projections as well and reaches similar conclusions in their projections. But this gives a breakdown of 3 different studies, a breakdown of the proportion of inflation in healthcare spending by cause. And, well, here's the bottom line. The demographic, the change in healthcare spending growth due to demographics is small compared to the overall growth in healthcare spending. What's the greatest component? Technology. The fact that we're getting better and better healthcare that uses very expensive technology. That's what accounts for most of this rapid increase in healthcare spending. We could spend whole sessions on healthcare. Maybe there is one coming up. So I just want to leave